There exists, somewhere in the archives of human memory, a question that has never been fully answered. What did the first person who ever asked, "Will I be remembered?" sound like? What language did they use? And did they know, somehow, that asking the question might be the only way to survive their own forgetting? 4,000 years ago, in a time so distant it feels more like dream than history, someone began writing down a story about a king who asked exactly this question. They pressed a reed into wet clay, then another, and in doing so, they gave us the oldest surviving story that humans have ever told themselves about what it means to exist at all. Imagine for a moment the Euphrates at dusk, not the river as you might see it now, constrained by concrete and machinery, but the river as it moved through ancient Mesopotamia, thick with the clay-red water that gave that whole civilization its name. The sun is descending, the light is turning gold and then amber, and the reeds along the marshland are beginning to blur into shadow. Mud brick buildings, shaped by human hands and baked solid by the Mesopotamian sun, stand in clusters along the riverbank. Their walls are the color of the earth itself, as though the city had simply grown up from the ground like a pale, squared crop. Smoke from evening fires rises here and there, not in thick columns, but in thin, wavering threads that catch the last light and seem to pause in the cooling air before dissolving. The smell would have been profound, not unpleasant, but thick, a mixture of river water, cooking fires, animal dung, ripening grain stored in granaries, the earthiness of soil still warm from the day, and underneath it all, the faint sound of the Euphrates itself, moving with the slow, patient breathing of something alive and ancient. The water would have gleamed like dark bronze in that fading light, and the palms that grew in scattered groves along its banks would have cast their fronds like sleeping hands against the dimming sky. This is where the story begins, though not in written form. The story existed first in the air itself, passed from one person's mouth to another's ear during these same kinds of evenings, for centuries, perhaps for over 1,000 years before anyone thought to fix it into clay and cuneiform. The story of a king named Gilgamesh, a name that would echo across 4 millennia and still reach your ears now, in darkness, as you listen. A name that would outlast empires, that would survive wars and the burial of cities, that would wait underground in the royal libraries of forgotten kings until archaeologists would one day unearth it and recognize it for what it was. The oldest sustained narrative in human writing. The question that animates this entire story, the question the first storyteller must have been asking as the sun set over those marshes, is one that still keeps us awake at night. What does it mean to live, knowing that we will die? What good is power, or beauty, or even friendship, if it all ends? Is there anything at all, that lasts beyond the reach of death's hand? These are questions that the ancient Mesopotamians asked just as urgently as we do now, and they asked them in a way so clear, so human, so devastatingly true, that the answer they found has never really needed updating. If you've ever wondered where humanity's deepest stories come from, or why some tales persist while others dissolve into nothing, then the journey through the Epic of Gilgamesh, the entire story of humanity's oldest surviving narrative, will unfold those mysteries in real time. If these questions speak to something in you, if the idea of walking with one of the first recorded humans through his own reckoning with mortality feels like something you need to hear, then subscribe to this series now, so you can drift through the whole epic as it was meant to be told, in one continuous, unbroken thread. Now, let the light continue to fade. Let the stars emerge. The Euphrates keeps moving. Somewhere in a house made of mud brick, a scribe sits with a tablet of clay still damp from the potter's wheel. In his hand, he holds a reed that has been cut at an angle. He dips it into prepared clay slip, and he begins to press, methodically, creating impressions that form wedges, cuneiform, the writing of wedges. Each small pressure of the reed creates a mark that will not fade, that will bake hard in the kiln, that will survive the collapse of kingdoms. He is not thinking about immortality as he works. He is simply transcribing what he has heard, what generations before him have spoken aloud into the cooling air of Mesopotamian evenings. But in doing so, he is performing an act so profound that we are still living in its shadow. The sky above Uruk, the city at the heart of this story, is darkening to deep purple. The evening star appears first, the brightest point of light, hanging like a single question mark above the ziggurats. And somewhere in that city, at the exact moment when day is tipping into night, a story about a king, the greatest king, the most restless king, the most human king, is being remembered, is being shaped by the voice that speaks it, is being passed onward into time, towards centuries of storytellers who will add their own breath to it, their own understanding, their own particular way of feeling what it means to reach for something that cannot be grasped. The night settles. The reeds whisper. The clay waits to receive its marks. And the first tablet of Gilgamesh, the prologue, the introduction, the ancient voice that will say, "He who has seen the depths," begins its long, patient journey toward you, toward this moment, toward the listening darkness of tonight. The story you've just entered, the one unfolding across millennia, nearly vanished forever. It slept beneath the earth for more than 2,000 years, pressed down under the weight of empires that rose and crumbled and turned to dust. And it took the patient work of a few Victorian gentlemen, men who believed that layer by layer, shard by shard, they could resurrect the voices of the ancient world, to bring it back into light. Picture, if you will, the middle of the 19th century. Archaeologists were beginning to understand that the mounds dotting the landscape of what is now Iraq, great tells as they're called, rolling hills that look almost natural to the untrained eye, were not geological accidents at all, but the compressed remains of entire civilizations. Centuries of settlement, destruction, rebuilding, destruction again, all compressed into these earthen monuments. One such mound rose near the modern town of Mosul, in northern Mesopotamia. The local people called it Kuyunjik, and beneath it, buried under perhaps 70 feet of accumulated soil and rubble, lay the palace and the library of King Ashurbanipal, one of the last great rulers of the Assyrian Empire, who had reigned around 665 centuries before the present moment. Ashurbanipal was no ordinary king. He was a collector, a scholar, a man possessed of an almost modern understanding that knowledge should be preserved, organized, protected for posterity. He had sent scribes throughout his kingdom and beyond, tasking them with copying the greatest literary works they could find, texts in Sumerian, in Akkadian, in older dialects and newer ones. He wanted his palace to contain the wisdom and the stories of his world, and so, around him in his rooms at Nineveh, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets accumulated, carefully catalogued, stored in archive rooms and on shelves, waiting in the darkness for someone to find them. That someone came in the form of Austen Henry Layard, a British archaeologist of remarkable energy and unconventional methods, who began excavations at Kuyunjik in 1845. Layard was part of a generation of Europeans who were discovering the ancient world almost by accident, or rather, by deliberate intent, yes, but often with the tools and frameworks of their own era, rather than the careful, stratigraphic precision we might recognize today. Still, his work was transformative. He uncovered the palace rooms, he found the tablets, and among thousands of fragments, many broken, many incomplete, many so fragile that they crumbled at the slightest careless touch, there emerged, gradually, a story that no one in the modern world had ever read before. The tablets bore cuneiform writing, that ancient script of pressed wedges and marks that the Mesopotamians had developed to record their world. The story they told, when slowly pieced together from multiple fragmentary copies, was of a great king named Gilgamesh, of his friendship with a wild man named Enkidu, of their adventures and their struggles against fate itself. And as scholars began to translate these texts, a process that took years, decades even, they realized something extraordinary. This was not merely an old story. This was, as far as anyone could tell, the oldest surviving epic narrative in the entire history of human civilization. No Homer, no Hesiod, no ancient Indian verses predated it. Gilgamesh was older than writing itself in some forms, passed down in oral tradition long before the scribes of Uruk and Babylon had committed it to clay. If you wish to follow the slow excavation of these ancient voices, the patient work of scholars piecing together fragments and deciphering scripts, consider subscribing to this series, where we'll continue to explore how buried stories reshape our understanding of what it means to be human. The realization struck slowly, you understand. It wasn't a sudden flash of recognition. Rather, as translator after translator worked through the tablets, adding to the growing corpus of understanding, the weight of the discovery accumulated. Here was a story that had been composed, in its fullest form, sometime between the 18th and 16th centuries before the Common Era, or possibly earlier in oral form, with roots stretching back to around 2,700 years before present, to a time when a king named Gilgamesh may have actually ruled the city of Uruk. The story had been copied and recopied by scribes across centuries. It had survived the fall of kingdoms, the shifting of power, the rise of new languages. It had endured because people kept choosing to tell it, to write it down, to preserve it. And when the final blow fell, when libraries burned and palaces crumbled, and the ancient world was swallowed by the medieval and modern periods, it had settled here, in the darkness beneath Nineveh, waiting. What impels a civilization to preserve a story so carefully, at such expense, across so many centuries? The question itself speaks to something deep in the human spirit. Perhaps Ashurbanipal, that great collector, sensed in Gilgamesh's struggle against mortality something that spoke to his own age, to the anxiety that haunts all of us in the night hours, the knowledge that we are finite, that our power cannot hold back time, that death comes for everyone, king and commoner alike. Or perhaps the story had simply become so woven into the cultural memory of Mesopotamia that it had to survive, as all profound narratives must, from generation to generation. The excavation at Nineveh continued throughout the latter 19th century. More tablets emerged. The picture grew more complete. And gradually, for those who took the time to read what the ancient scribes had so carefully preserved, a narrative of extraordinary depth and humanity began to unfold, a story that would prove to be the ancestor of all later epics, the seed from which Homer and the writers of the Bible and countless other storytellers would draw inspiration, sometimes knowingly, often unconsciously, as if the archetypal patterns of Gilgamesh had seeped so deeply into the human imagination that they required no direct transmission to echo through the ages. The tablets themselves, though, tell a quiet tale in their material form. They do not announce their importance. They are modest objects, often no larger than the palm of a hand, hardened clay bearing the pressed marks of reed styluses. To hold one is to hold something that a scribe pressed and shaped more than 4,000 years ago, someone whose name we will never know, who was doing their work in the service of an empire that has utterly vanished from the earth. And yet through that anonymous labor, we are able to sit in the modern night and listen to the voice of Gilgamesh, calling across an abyss of millennia, still seeking to tell us something vital about loss, friendship, kingship, and the human confrontation with the boundary we cannot cross. The story itself, however, did not arrive to us as a single unified text waiting in a tomb. What we possess today is something far more fragmented, far more woven together from scattered pieces, much like reconstructing a voice from echoes across 4,000 years. The Gilgamesh we read now is the patient work of modern scholars piecing together clay tablets that were never meant to survive at all, pressed by hands that have long since returned to dust, in a language most of the world had forgotten until archaeologists learned to read it again. To understand how this happened, you must imagine yourself in a Mesopotamian scribal school, perhaps around the second millennium before the Common Era, where young men sat in rows learning the craft that would give them power and status. The tool in their hand was not a pen or a brush, but a reed stylus, cut at an angle so that its edge could press into clay. The clay itself came from the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris, kneaded and prepared until it reached the perfect consistency, firm enough to hold an impression but still yielding, still responsive to the scribe's touch. Before them lay thousands upon thousands of tablets, some the size of a thumbnail, others as large as a man's hand, each one waiting to receive words that might endure. The writing system they used was cuneiform, whose name comes from the Latin for wedge-shaped, because that is precisely what it looks like when you hold an ancient tablet to the light and trace your fingers across the impressed marks. Each stroke is a deliberate jab or drag of the reed into the soft surface, creating patterns of tiny wedges that, when read together, form a language of astonishing complexity and beauty. There is nothing naturally intuitive about cuneiform. It does not picture the things it describes. A scribe did not draw a picture of water to mean water. Instead, they pressed a specific cluster of wedges into the clay, and through long training and memory, that cluster came to represent the concept, the word, the sound. It is one of humanity's earliest writing systems, and perhaps for that reason, it is also one of the most demanding to master. Now, the oldest fragments of the Gilgamesh story do not come to us in the language we typically call Akkadian, which was the lingua franca of Mesopotamia for centuries, the language of trade and governance and empire. Some of the earliest versions appear in an even older tongue, Sumerian, which was already ancient when Akkadian scribes were copying and adapting the tales. These Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh circulated separately, each one focusing on a different episode or adventure, a different facet of the king's life and legend. They were not originally parts of a grand narrative arc, but rather individual stories that existed in oral tradition first, then were written down and preserved, each on its own tablet or series of tablets. Picture a scribe in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, perhaps in the 7th century before the Common Era, tasked with preserving the wisdom and stories of the empire he served. He would have had access to older copies, fragmentary versions, texts written in Sumerian, and texts translated into Akkadian, and his work would have been to synthesize them, to create a coherent narrative from these scattered sources. But cuneiform writing on clay creates a particular kind of fragility. A tablet could crack if it dried too quickly or too unevenly. Words could be smudged or pressed incompletely if the stylus slipped. Some tablets were deliberately baked in kilns to make them more durable, but not all. Many were left in their raw state, vulnerable to moisture and time. What this means is that the Gilgamesh we reconstruct today is less like a book that was carefully composed and bound and preserved in pristine condition, and more like a song that was learned by ear across generations. Each singer adding their own interpretation, each version influenced by the listeners and the moment. When modern scholars assembled the 12 tablets that form what we now call the standard Babylonian version, they were doing detective work of the most delicate kind, comparing fragments held in museums across the world, matching breaks in the clay from different pieces, listening for consistency in the scribal hand and the cuneiform patterns, searching for passages that seemed to belong together because they continued a narrative or echoed a phrase. Some sections of the story are complete, others exist only in fragments, with gaps where clay has been lost to time or careless handling in antiquity. In these gaps, the text itself becomes quieter, more meditative, because we are forced to imagine what was said, to sit with uncertainty and absence. There are variant versions too, older Sumerian poems that tell of Gilgamesh's marriage to Ishtar, or his journeys that differ in detail or emphasis from the Akkadian compilation. None of these versions is the definitive original, because there never was such a thing. The story was always alive, always changing, always being rewritten by whoever held the stylus. The act of reading cuneiform requires a shift in how we think about text itself. These were not words meant to be read silently by an individual in solitude. They were meant to be read aloud, declaimed in scribal schools, or to audiences gathered in courtyards, heard as much as seen. The wedges pressed into clay are a frozen moment of that vocalization, a record of breath and rhythm and emphasis that we must now reconstruct through imagination and scholarly instinct. When you trace your finger across a tablet and feel the slight raised patterns where the reed once pressed, you are touching the very physical act of transmission, the moment when a story held in human memory became fixed in material form. Now, beneath the layers of myth and poetic embellishment, there exists a curious possibility that has occupied scholars for well over a century, the notion that at the heart of this ancient story, there may have lived an actual human being, a real man, a king who walked the streets of a real city, made decisions that affected real lives, and whose name and deeds were so remarkable that they echoed forward through time, gathering ornament and divinity like a stone rolling through ages, accumulating moss and legend. The evidence is fragmentary, as you might expect from a period so distant that even 4,000 years seems a near and generous approximation. But in the king lists of Mesopotamia, those careful bureaucratic records that scribes maintained with the same devoted attention they gave to all their tallies and inventories, there appears a name, Aga of Kish, and then, shortly thereafter, a figure called Gilgamesh. The king lists suggest he may have ruled the city of Uruk sometime around the year 2700 before our current age, though the margins of uncertainty are considerable. Perhaps a generation either way, perhaps longer. History at that distance does not offer precision, it offers probability dressed in whispers. What is intriguing is not the certainty of his existence, but rather the manner in which certainty itself seems to have been transformed over the centuries. If such a king did indeed reign in Uruk, he would have been one ruler among many, governing a walled city in southern Mesopotamia during the early dynastic period. He would have commanded irrigated fields, maintained merchants' records, administered justice of some kind, and left behind him the ordinary residue of power, building projects, perhaps military campaigns, administrative decisions both wise and foolish. Nothing, on its surface, that would necessarily distinguish him from dozens of other Bronze Age sovereigns whose names have otherwise vanished into the dust from which they came. And yet somewhere, at some point difficult to pinpoint with certainty, the memory of this man began to transform. The retelling deepened. Stories accumulated, perhaps in his own lifetime, or perhaps not until decades or centuries after his death. People began to tell new things about him, grander things. The stories grew not out of deliberate falsehood, but rather out of the natural human tendency to enlarge what is already impressive, to add dimension to what already seems significant. He became, in the telling and retelling, 2/3 divine. His strength became superhuman. His restlessness became cosmic dissatisfaction. His friendship with another man became an epic bond that would outlast empires. This is how memory hardens into legend. It does not happen through a single decision or a moment of conscious distortion. Rather, it is the accumulated weight of countless voices, each adding their own small elaboration, their own interpretation, their own sense of what the story ought to mean and how it ought to unfold. A king who was perhaps temperamental in life becomes, in legend, a figure of such unbridled energy that his own city cries out against him. A man who may have sought some form of wisdom or meaning becomes a seeker of immortality itself. A companion becomes a brother bound by bonds deeper than blood. There is something almost tender in this process when you consider it from a distance. It speaks to a fundamental human hunger to discover meaning in the lives of those who came before, to see in their struggles and triumphs something that speaks to our own condition. The real king of Uruk, if he was indeed a real king, becomes a vessel into which an entire civilization pours its own concerns, its own questions, its own profound anxieties about power and friendship and death and what it means to be human in a world that will ultimately deny us permanence. The ancient Sumerians, and later the Akkadians who spoke and wrote Gilgamesh's story, were not engaged in historical documentation as we understand it now. They were not trying to preserve factual accuracy, as a modern biographer might attempt. Instead, they were reaching towards something they recognized as deeper truth, the emotional and spiritual reality of what kingship meant, what isolation meant, what it cost to lose someone you loved, what it meant to confront the reality of your own mortality. And if in the process they transformed an actual human being into a figure who could wrestle with demons and travel to the ends of the earth and speak with gods, then perhaps this was not a corruption of memory, but rather its fullest possible expression. The centuries of retelling, the accumulation of Sumerian tales and Akkadian recensions, the gradual synthesis of older poems into the unified epic that Ashurbanipal's scribes so carefully copied onto their clay tablets. All of this represents not a movement away from truth, but a peculiar journey toward a different kind of truth. The kind of truth that does not reside in historical fact, but in the resonance between a story and the human heart. The kind of truth that explains why someone 4,000 years ago was worth remembering, why their name was worth inscribing in clay, why their struggles mattered enough to retell again and again across centuries. This is the curious archaeology of the human spirit that lies beneath the epic. The real king, obscured by time and the fog of history, becomes the mythic king, illuminated by the collective imagination of countless generations. And in becoming mythic, he also becomes more true in a way, more true to human experience, more true to the yearning and confusion and desperate reaching that defines our time on this earth. The specific facts of his reign may be lost forever, but the emotional truth of what his story came to represent endures, waiting patiently in clay, waiting for us to find it and recognize ourselves within its ancient lines. Picture now the city itself, if you will, as it might have appeared in those long twilight hours when the sun descended beyond the western marshes and the dust of the day began to settle over the great walls of Uruk. Imagine the monumental brick facades, not the gleaming stone of later empires, but the warm, sand-colored mud brick, still holding the heat of the day, slowly releasing it into the cooling air. The walls stretched upward in their squared immensity, constructed across generations, a barrier between the order of human settlement and the wilderness that pressed always at the edges of civilization. Within those walls lay a city of remarkable sophistication for its time, perhaps the first true metropolis the world had yet known. The streets were arranged with a kind of organic logic, widening at gathering places, narrowing at residential quarters where clay brick houses clustered in the gentle darkness, and there, rising above the rooflines like a mountain made by human hands, stood the great ziggurat of Iana, the temple district dedicated to Inanna, the fierce goddess of love and war. These stepped structures, built brick upon brick in careful layers, served as cosmic bridges, earthly anchors for the divine realm that Mesopotamians believed extended upward into the starlit expanse. But what may strike us most vividly, if we could walk those streets in our imagination, would be the traces of water everywhere. The Euphrates flowed near the city's edges, yes, but the true genius of Uruk lay in its irrigation canals, channels both grand and modest, that channeled water into the surrounding fields, turning the marginal landscape into fields of grain and date palms. These canals were the lifeblood of the city's prosperity, engineered with such care that some historians suggest they may have required a form of centralized planning, a coordination of labor that spoke to the very concept of governance itself. What kind of power would be needed, one might gently wonder, to command the water itself? And it was within this ordered magnificence, this achievement of walls and temples and canals, that there ruled a king whose nature seemed almost restless in its excess. Gilgamesh was his name, and though he was human, or at least mortal in the way that even kings could be, the tradition that preserved his story insisted on his extraordinary composition. He was 2/3 divine, the tales whispered, descended from the gods themselves, which may have meant simply that his bloodline was considered sacred, or that his power seemed almost superhuman to those who knew him. What would it mean to be 2/3 God? A voice in the old stories seemed to ask, and only 1/3 bound by the limitations of human flesh. The historical Gilgamesh, for there almost certainly was a real king by this name, a fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk, who may have ruled around the 27th century before the Common Era, would have been a figure of genuine authority and military accomplishment. But the Gilgamesh of the epic, the one whose deeds the scribes pressed into wet clay, was something more than a king. He was an embodiment of raw, unchanneled power. He was described as extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily terrible in equal measure. His beauty drew people to him. His strength overwhelmed them, and yet, in the way that the oldest stories about power often reveal, there was something tragic in his restlessness, something unsettled in his magnificence. For Gilgamesh could not be still. The walls he had built, and yes, it was Gilgamesh who was credited with constructing the great walls of Uruk, a task that would have required the labor of many. Those walls were not enough. His energy, it seemed, could not be contained within even the grandest city. He ranged through Uruk with a kind of fevered intensity, and it was this very intensity that began to trouble the peace of those who lived beneath his rule. The poem speaks of how he wore out his people. The young men of the city were exhausted by the demands he placed on them, drawn into his endless projects and pursuits. The young women, it was said, he took according to his pleasure, invoking what was called the right of the king, a privilege so absolute that it became a kind of tyranny. This is not a simple portrait of villainy, though. We must hold the complexity gently. Gilgamesh was not cruel for cruelty's sake, nor was he malicious in intent. Rather, he was animated by something more like an immortal's disregard for the finite nature of mortal life. He burned through the resources and the people around him because it seemed, on some level, that there should always be more projects, more experiences, more sensation, more power. It was as though he could not believe that he should be limited by anything at all, which, given that he was told to be 2/3 divine, made a certain kind of sense. The gods, after all, did not exhaust themselves. They did not tire. They did not fade. And Gilgamesh, carrying divinity within him, seemed to expect the same of himself. The people of Uruk cried out. This is where the story truly begins, not with the king in his magnificence, but with the voices of those who suffered under his power. They made their prayers to the gods, their complaint rising up from the dust and the weariness of their lives, asking for some intercession, some end to the relentless demands of their king. And the gods, it is said, heard these prayers. They listened to the voices of the exhausted and the oppressed, and they began to consider what might be done about a king who seemed to think himself immortal, who burned through mortal life as though he alone mattered, whose restlessness was becoming a plague upon the city he ruled. In the quiet of Uruk's nights, as the city settled into uneasy sleep, the gods were already stirring. A plan was forming in the cosmic realm, one that would send down into the world a figure unlike any Gilgamesh had yet encountered, a being who might match his strength, his wildness, his refusal to bend to ordinary limits. Neither god nor king, neither civilized nor entirely wild, this figure would be created from the very clay of the earth, shaped by divine hands, and sent down to walk upon the lands beyond the city. And it was this mysterious other, this unexpected mirror, that would change everything about who Gilgamesh was and what he might become. But that transformation lay still ahead, waiting in the story's patient unfolding, as the night deepened and the city slept. In the high councils of the gods, there arose a conversation about Gilgamesh, a dialogue born not of anger, but of concern, a realization that perhaps the wildness of a single man needed tempering, that the city of Uruk, for all its walls and gates, could not contain the force of a king who seemed barely mortal himself. The gods spoke together in that distant realm beyond the waking world, and their remedy was not to strike him down or diminish him, but to fashion a rival, a balance, a creature who might meet the restless king on equal ground, and draw him towards something other than dominion. So it was that Aruru, the mother goddess of creation, the one who had herself shaped Gilgamesh from the dust of the world, was called upon once more. She rose from her meditative dwelling, gathered the essence of the earth in her hands, the primordial clay, still damp and alive with the memory of forming things, and she began to shape, not with the intention of crafting a king or a citizen, but something wilder, something that belonged to no city and acknowledged no wall. The Akkadian verses tell us she shaped a figure equal in strength to Gilgamesh, limb for limb, muscle by muscle, a form so powerful that it seemed to embody the very force of nature itself, untamed and unaware of its own magnificence. This was Enkidu, though the oldest Sumerian poems knew him by other names, or sometimes by no name at all, simply the one from the wilderness, the one who belonged to the animals. When Enkidu first opened his eyes, or however we might imagine the awakening of one made from clay, he did not see temples or irrigation ditches or the ordered world of human society. He saw the grasses bending in wind, the paths where gazelles moved, the water gathering in stone depressions, the horizon stretching endlessly. His first knowledge was not of language or laws, but of hunger and thirst, and the strange joy of movement, of muscles discovering themselves through running, of breath becoming wild and rhythmic as he moved across the open land. There is something profound in the image the poem holds for us. Enkidu among the herds, living as the animals themselves lived, eating grass where they ate it, drinking from the same waters, moving with their migrations. He was neither one thing nor the other, not quite animal, yet utterly severed from the human world that had breathed meaning into Gilgamesh. Some scholars have wondered whether this vision echoed the actual way that early shepherds and herders lived, moving with their flocks, sleeping under open sky, their lives indistinguishable in rhythm from the creatures they tended, and there is wisdom in that wondering. The Mesopotamians knew this boundary, the thin, permeable line between civilization and wilderness, between the ordered and the unbounded, and they placed Enkidu precisely there, in that liminal space. The gazelles knew him. In the ancient poem, the language suggests a kinship so complete that when he moved among them, hunters who had tracked these animals for generations found their prey suddenly absent, vanished into the herds, indistinguishable from their protector. What was Enkidu protecting them from? Not out of conscious choice, perhaps, but simply through his presence, through the sheer force of his being alongside them. The hunters saw their hunting grounds emptied and grew puzzled, troubled, then afraid. A creature walked among the animals who could match the animals' speed and grace, yet who possessed something more, something that seemed to gather the herds around him like a shepherd gathers sheep. Consider for a moment the loneliness that might accompany such an existence, the perfection of it, and the utter alienation. Enkidu was strong beyond measure, free from all constraint, lacking any master or rival, yet living in a state of profound isolation from his own kind, unable to understand or be understood by any of the beings he shared the world with. He had no language, or if he did, it was the language of hunger and rest, of the rhythm of seasons, of the animal knowledge that flows through bodies without words. The clay of his making had contained no memory of cities, no imprint of human culture, no code of law or conduct. He was innocence itself, though an innocence vast and powerful enough to bewilder the hunters and shake the certainties of men. How long he lived in this state, the poem does not precisely tell us. Time moved differently in the wilderness than it did in Uruk, where the king's day was marked by rituals and judgments and the orderly turning of civic life. Enkidu's time was marked only by the cycles of animals, the seasons of growth and dormancy, the slow turning of years that left no record, no inscription upon clay. And then something shifted, as though the thread the gods had woven was drawing taut, pulling him toward an inevitable meeting, a collision of two forces that would reshape both their lives and begin the true story of the epic we remember. Out in the grasslands where Enkidu had spent his early years, moving like the gazelles themselves, drinking at the same waterholes, sleeping beneath the same stars, there came a moment when his solitude was interrupted by another kind of presence entirely. The gods had decided that Gilgamesh needed a match, a friend, a counterweight to his restless tyranny. And so into Enkidu's world of wind and herd and open horizon came a woman named Shamhat, a priestess of the temple, sent deliberately to the watering hole where the wild man was known to gather with the animals. She was no ordinary messenger. In the oldest Mesopotamian understanding, there was power in her presence, in her knowledge of the city and its ways, in the very fact that she represented a world entirely foreign to the creature Enkidu had become. When Enkidu first saw her, he did not flee. There is something in the ancient texts, written now on clay, that has survived for nearly 4,000 years, that suggests a kind of recognition between them, though neither could have understood it at the time. Shamhat approached with patience. She did not demand or threaten. Instead, she invited him into her presence with gestures of welcome, and over the course of days, the texts are deliberately unclear about the exact duration, leaving that blank space for us to imagine. She taught him what it meant to live as humans live. What scholars have gently understood about this encounter is that it was sensual, intimate, and utterly transformative. Shamhat shared her body with him, yes, but more than that, she shared knowledge that could not be unlearned, the taste of bread, the texture of woven cloth against skin, the warmth of shelter, the sound of human language shaped by a human throat, rather than the cries and calls of beasts. There is something quietly profound about the way the ancient text treats this moment. It is not presented as a violation or a tragedy, but as a kind of gentle initiation. Shamhat was not conquering Enkidu. She was opening a door, and once opened, he could not close it again. After their time together, when Enkidu returned to the grazing herds and the gazelles he had known all his life, they scattered at the sight of him. Can you imagine that recognition? That the animals themselves knew something fundamental in him had changed? He could no longer move as they moved. His body had altered. His instincts had shifted. He was no longer fully of their world, and yet he was not quite ready to be of the human world either. He existed between them, caught in a threshold. Shamhat saw what was happening and understood. She spoke to him of the great city of Uruk, of its walls and its king, of the possibility of companionship and meaning beyond the solitary life he had lived. She dressed him, she fed him properly, not the raw meat of the hunter, but bread and beer, the staples of civilization, and she invited him to follow her back toward the lights of human habitation. When Enkidu first entered Uruk, the text tells us that people gathered to stare at him. They had heard stories of such a being, powerful, uncultivated, bearing the strength of nature itself in his frame. But what strikes the careful reader is that Enkidu did not rampage through the city. He did not behave like a wild thing set loose among the orderly streets and temples. Instead, he walked, and he watched, and he began to understand the rhythms of human existence. The shepherds of Uruk came to him, brought him into their company, taught him the skills of their trade. It is almost as though his wildness was being slowly alchemized, not into taming, but into a different kind of power, the power to understand both worlds, to exist fully in neither, and therefore perhaps to bridge them in some way that neither the city nor the wilderness could do alone. And then came the night when Enkidu stood in the street of Uruk and heard that the king was coming. Gilgamesh, in his restless energy, had decided to come between a newly married couple on their wedding night. This was his right, you see. In the ancient understanding of kingship, the ruler had certain prerogatives, certain privileges that set him apart from ordinary men. He intended to exercise that right, to assert his power through that most intimate of invasions, and no one expected to stop him. But as he approached, he found Enkidu standing in his path. No words were exchanged at first. There was only the meeting of two men, each embodying a different kind of strength. Gilgamesh, the manufactured king, the two-thirds divine creation of human ambition, met Enkidu, the earth-born wild thing now learned in the ways of men, and they began to wrestle. The wrestling match between them is described in the texts with a kind of breathless intensity. They grappled and strained. They were almost evenly matched, though the accounts vary slightly between the different versions of the story preserved on clay. What matters is not who won, though the texts do offer an answer, but what the struggle represented. It was the collision of two different understandings of what power meant. It was also, perhaps, recognition. Two incomplete beings meeting and recognizing in the other a wholeness they had been seeking without knowing it. The wrestling match lasted through the night and into the dawn, until gradually, imperceptibly, the contest transformed into something else entirely. Exhaustion gave way to respect. Competition dissolved into understanding. By the time the sun had risen fully over Uruk's walls, something had fundamentally shifted. Gilgamesh found that he could not truly defeat this man who had arrived from the wilderness, and Enkidu found that the king, for all his seeming invulnerability, was not his enemy, but rather his reflection, his necessary complement. Where Gilgamesh had been isolated in his power, restless in his divinity, separated from his own people by the very privileges that set him apart, Enkidu offered something precious, genuine companionship, equality, the meeting of true peers. They embraced then, or so the story tells us, and in that embrace, something in both of them healed. A loneliness neither had been able to name suddenly found voice. The texts become warmer in tone as they describe the aftermath. Enkidu was brought into the palace. He and Gilgamesh ate together, slept in proximity, their lives becoming intertwined with a swiftness and completeness that speaks to something deeper than mere friendship. They became brothers, the oldest tales suggest. More than brothers, they became incomplete without each other, two halves of a consciousness that neither could have fully inhabited alone. Gilgamesh ceased his tyrannies almost immediately. The oppression that had weighed on Uruk began to ease. Some scholars have wondered whether this transformation is simply a convenience of the narrative, a way of clearing the moral ground before the adventure that would follow. But there is something more psychologically true in it than mere plot mechanics. Genuine love, genuine connection to another conscious being, changes us. It changes what we believe we can allow ourselves to do. It transforms cruelty into compassion, almost without our noticing the transition. In the quiet nights of Uruk, as the city settled into sleep around them, Gilgamesh and Enkidu would sit together, and the distance that had once existed between them, between nature and civilization, between wildness and order, between solitude and belonging, would feel less like a chasm and more like a boundary they could cross together whenever they wished. And in those nights, the stage was being set for the great adventure that both of them had been incomplete without, though neither had known to dream it. In the aftermath of their wrestling match, that moment when two forces of equal strength collided and neither fell, when exhaustion became recognition, something shifted in both men. Gilgamesh, who had known only the loneliness of absolute power, of being two-thirds divine in a city where everyone else was merely mortal, found himself face to face with a mirror of his own intensity. And Enkidu, fresh from the wilderness, learning still the taste of bread and beer, discovering that his wild heart could beat in rhythm with another's, learned what it meant to be seen by an equal. The scribes tell us that they became inseparable. Picture, if you will, the evenings in Uruk, when the heat of the day finally released its grip and the city settled into a gentler rhythm. The great ziggurats cast long shadows across the irrigation channels. Somewhere in the distance, the Euphrates murmured beneath palms that had grown old alongside human memory. And in the palace, though the text doesn't say this directly, and we must listen carefully to what echoes between the fragments, Gilgamesh and Enkidu would have walked together. What did they speak of during those quiet hours? The epic gives us hunger and thirst more readily than conversation. We know they feasted together, that Gilgamesh showed Enkidu the customs of civilization, taught him the wearing of clothes and the drinking of beer, 7 cups, they say, until Enkidu's heart grew merry and his countenance brightened. These were the first nights of a friendship that would reshape what Gilgamesh understood about being alive. For Enkidu had taught him something no priest or courtier could, what it felt like to meet someone not as a subject, not as someone bound by the chains of ritual and throne, but as an equal, a friend. This is what people often miss about Gilgamesh. He was not simply a tyrant to be overthrown. He was a young god trapped in a city where his godliness made connection impossible. His energies, supernatural, restless, never satisfied, poured into oppression not out of malice but out of a desperate, unreflective hunger for something real. And now that hunger had found its match in Enkidu. Together they felt complete in a way neither had felt alone. The ancient Sumerian poems that fed into this epic tell us that Enkidu gave Gilgamesh counsel, that their minds intertwined like date palms growing from the same root. Can you imagine the quality of that companionship? To have someone who could withstand your strength, who would not flinch or bow, who would say no and mean it. And yet, there is a turning point that scholars have sensed in the tablets. Even when the words grow faint or damaged, even in those nights of deepening friendship, even as the two men learned each other's ways and laughed together in Uruk's palace, something else was stirring. The epic does not make clear who proposed the adventure first. Perhaps it was Gilgamesh's restlessness finding new form, or perhaps it was Enkidu, still touched with the wildness of his origins, feeling the pull of the dangerous world beyond the walls. But into their quiet nights came whispers of the cedar forest. The cedar forest was not a place anyone spoke of lightly. It lay distant, beyond the known world, protected by Humbaba, a guardian of such terrible power that his gaze itself was said to bring paralysis. To the Mesopotamians who first told and retold this story, the cedar forest represented something sacred and forbidden, the boundary between the human realm and something else. It was where the trees grew tall enough to touch the heavens. It was wealth itself, for cedar wood was precious beyond measure, a material so valuable that kings would wage wars to possess it. But it was also a threshold. To seek it was to court the attention of the gods themselves. Why did the friends feel drawn toward this danger? The tablet fragments suggest several motives, and perhaps none of them, or all of them, are true. Gilgamesh, we might think, chafed still against the limits of mortality, to accomplish something great, something that would echo through the ages, something that would prove that even a half-mortal man could achieve the impossible. Did that not appeal to him? And Enkidu, though his life had been extended and enriched by Uruk, carried still in his bones the memory of wilderness, the knowledge that true aliveness lived in the untamed places beyond the city walls. But there is another current running beneath the epic that we must not overlook. The gods themselves seemed restless with these two. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu had altered something in the balance of Uruk. The oppression had ceased. The young king's energies were turned inward, toward companionship, toward the revelation that transcendence might be found not in domination but in connection. Did the gods worry about what would happen if Gilgamesh stayed in this new peace, anchored by love? Did they whisper the suggestion into dreams, plant the seed of adventure, direct these two toward a destiny that would separate them? The text is deliberately opaque on these points. What we know is only this. As the nights in Uruk deepened, and the friendship between the two men solidified into something unshakable, the pull toward the cedar forest grew stronger. It was not a decision they made once and then acted upon. It was something that grew gradually, occupying more of their thoughts, shifting from idle speculation to serious planning. They would go. They would face Humbaba. They would bring back the cedars. They would accomplish a deed so great that even the gods would have to recognize their worth. And so we find ourselves at a threshold within the threshold. The friendship that had seemed so complete, so restorative to both men, now carried within it the seeds of separation. For adventure is never only adventure. It is always also a leaving behind, a transformation, a step into the unknown, from which one returns changed, if one returns at all. In those quiet nights in Uruk, did Gilgamesh and Enkidu speak of this? Did they acknowledge the danger they were about to face, or did they move toward it as young men do, with the kind of certainty that believes in their own immortality, their own exception, their own rightness? The walls of Uruk would remain behind them. The rivers would continue to flow. The city would wait, though no one could have known what would return from the distant forest, or who would return, and who would not. The two friends stood at the edge of Uruk one morning, and something had shifted in the weight of the air around them. Gilgamesh, no longer restless within his own walls, had turned his boundless energy outward, toward a place that existed at the rim of the known world, where the gods themselves had planted a forest of towering cedars, and where no mortal king had ever dared to venture and returned alive. Enkidu knew this land in ways his friend could only imagine. He had drunk from its waters in his dreams of wildness, felt the trembling of its ancient earth beneath gazelle hooves when he still ran with the herds. Yet even Enkidu's knowledge felt small and uncertain as they prepared to leave the cultivated world behind. The journey itself became a slow descent into landscape that grew wilder with each step, each day blending into the next, in a rhythm that must have felt almost like drowning in time. Ancient Mesopotamian travelers, and this comes to us through fragmentary texts and the memory of place names that persist even now, would have followed the tributaries northward and eastward, away from the irrigation channels and date palms, away from the mud brick houses stacked like careful thoughts. The air would have changed gradually. The ground beneath their feet shifted from tilled earth to rougher terrain, from the managed gardens of civilization towards something untended and vast. The scorching days gave way to nights so deep and full of stars that a man might have felt his own smallness pressing down on him like a physical thing. What draws us to follow them, even now, listening in the dark? Perhaps it is that this is a journey without maps, a passage into uncertainty that mirrors something in our own hearts. The knowledge that beyond the walls of everything we have built lies something we do not understand, and something in us that is called by it nonetheless. The cedar forest, when it appeared, did not announce itself gently. It rose like a wall of shadow and fragrance, an altar of wood so ancient that the trees themselves seemed to have grown into the very memory of the world. The cedar land, Humbaba's domain, was not merely a place to the Mesopotamian imagination. It was a threshold. It was where the natural world turned inward, where it became sacred, where it became dangerous. The gods had put it there deliberately, at the edge of human reach, guarded not by walls of stone, but by something far more terrible, a single being so powerful that his very presence was said to corrupt the air around him, to fill men's hearts with a kind of paralysis that preceded death. Humbaba the Guardian. The texts call him the Terrible Guardian, sometimes the Watchman of the Forest. Try to imagine him now, sinking deeper into the story as the night deepens around you. He was not entirely beast, not entirely man, but something between. His voice was thunder, his breath was fire, his cry could be heard across leagues of distance, and those who heard it were said to lose the strength in their legs. Some accounts suggest his body was protected by 7 layers of supernatural armor, each one harder to pierce than the last. Others describe him as something closer to nature itself, a forest spirit, ancient and territorial, with the right to destroy anything that threatened his sacred charge. The texts are unclear, as ancient texts often are, about whether Gilgamesh and Enkidu truly understood the magnitude of what waited for them. But as they ventured deeper into that columned shade, past the threshold where civilization's scent could no longer reach them, something in both men must have shifted. For Enkidu, this was a return to wildness, yet it was a wildness transformed by the time he had spent in the city. For Gilgamesh, it was the first moment in his life where his godlike strength might not be enough. Kings are accustomed to being gods. What happens when a god ventures into a place where another god's law is written across the very ground? The encounter itself, when it came, was not a quick thing. The texts suggest a gradual awareness, a slow building of dread, before the actual confrontation. Humbaba did not simply attack. He made himself known. The earth trembled. The trees seemed to lean inward as if listening. And then, finally, the battle began. A wrestling match so fierce and primal that it reads almost as a conversation between two forces of nature trying to establish dominance over the same piece of the world. Here is where the moral weight of the story begins to shift, in ways that the ancient Akkadian and Sumerian texts themselves seem to acknowledge, though not explicitly. Humbaba was not evil. He was not corrupt. He was simply doing what he had been made to do, guarding the sacred cedar forest against mortal trespass. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeated him, and the texts describe a victory that requires trickery as much as strength, Their friend's knowledge of vulnerability, combined with a king's relentless will, they were committing what we might now call an act of transgression. They were cutting down what the gods had protected. They were crossing a line that existed not to keep them out of goodness, but because some boundaries, some knowledge, some resources, are meant to remain beyond human reach. The cedar they carried back to Uruk, logs so vast and sacred that they would be used to build the great gate and the temple, came at a cost that neither man fully understood yet. They had won a victory, yes. They had proven their strength, yes. But they had also announced themselves to the powers that had been watching them since Enkidu's creation. We are not content with the world as you have made it. We will take what you have forbidden. We will push past your guardians. The forest, in the cooling darkness of this hour, becomes something that speaks to the listeners of stories. It is always the place where human will meets something that cannot be conquered by will alone. It is where ambition meets consequence. And the two friends, walking back through the gates of Uruk, carrying their cedar, were walking towards something they could not yet name, something that would shatter the certainty between them and teach Gilgamesh, at last, what it meant to truly be mortal. The cedar trees that Gilgamesh and Enkidu sought were not mere timber in the minds of those who first whispered this story across firelit courtyards and into the cool nights of Mesopotamia. To understand their journey toward that distant forest is to understand something far older than the two heroes themselves. It is to glimpse the ancient human experience of standing at the edge of the known world and feeling, in that moment, both the pull of conquest and the weight of transgression. The land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, was itself a place of careful boundaries. The irrigated fields fanned outward in geometric precision from the great cities. Water was channeled, controlled, bent to human will through ingenious systems of dikes and canals. The marshlands stretched in their wild profusion, where man's hand had not yet reached. The deserts beyond offered nothing but thirst and exposure. But further still, northward and eastward, lay the mountains and the great forests that cloaked them, and in those heights grew the cedars, trees of such size and fragrance that they seemed to belong not to the ordinary world, but to the realm of the gods themselves. The cedar was precious beyond measure to the Mesopotamians. Their own land, you see, offered no such timber. The plains yielded date palms and tamarisks, reeds and rushes good for building and fire, but nothing that could match the straight grain and imperishable wood of the cedar. When a king wished to build a temple worthy of heaven, when he needed beams that would not rot or warp, he looked toward those distant groves. The cedar became, in consequence, a symbol of something unreachable, something that required not merely labor, but transgression, some crossing of an invisible line that separated the human realm from the sacred. Why should this have been so? Perhaps it was simply geography and economics. The cedar forests lay beyond the protective walls of civilization, in wild lands where bandits and wild beasts held dominion. But to the ancient mind, geography and the sacred were not separate languages. The forest itself was understood as a threshold, a boundary between the world of human order and the untamed world of nature, which belonged to the gods or to God's servants. Humbaba, the guardian who burned Gilgamesh's nostrils with his breath and whose roar could shatter mountains, was not merely a practical obstacle. He was the embodiment of that boundary itself, the divine prohibition against mortals taking what belonged to the sacred realm. The question that haunts any reflection on this part of the story is whether Gilgamesh and Enkidu understood, even dimly, that they were committing a kind of cosmic trespass. Did they see themselves as heroes defending human dominion over nature, or did they sense, in the whispered stories of the forest, that they were about to touch something not meant for mortal hands? The text itself remains beautifully ambiguous on this point. The two friends speak of glory, of immortal fame, of building monuments with cedar wood that will outlast them. They frame their quest in the language of heroic accomplishment. Yet the story itself, in its deepest layers, seems to question whether such ambitions are truly their own, or whether they are being drawn towards something darker, something that will teach them, through blood and shadow, what it means to be human. The cedar forest, in the imagination of those who told this story, represented the frontier of human knowledge and capability. It was where the maps ended. It was where the voices of scribes and scholars grew quiet, and the stories began, not of clear victory, but of encounter with something genuinely other, something that possessed its own will and agency, that human desire could not simply override. In our modern age, we speak easily of dominion over nature, of progress, of resources to be harvested and extracted and transformed into the monuments of human ambition. But listen to how this ancient story frames it, and you hear a different music entirely. The Mesopotamians had achieved extraordinary things. They had invented writing itself, had built cities of astonishing complexity, had created systems of law and administration that still echo in our modern world. Yet in their deepest stories, they seemed to carry a knowledge that achievement always had a cost, that crossing certain thresholds brought consequences, that nature was not inert material, waiting to be shaped, but something alive with divine presence, something that could resist, that could anger, that could teach through suffering. The cedar forest was the place where that teaching began. It is worth pausing here to consider what the cedar represented to the people who told this story, and what it might represent to us as we drift deeper into this narrative, deeper into a meditation on human limits and the boundary between ambition and wisdom. The forest itself, in those ancient texts, is described with a strange admixture of beauty and dread. It is a place of grandeur, of mighty trees that cast the world into green shadow, of beauty so profound it approaches the sacred. But it is also a place of danger, where the guardian's presence transforms the air itself into something heavy and oppressive, where the very act of entering is felt as violation. The cutting down of the cedar, when it finally occurs, is narrated with a kind of ceremonial weight. It is not a casual felling, but an act that requires courage, that tests the friendship between the two heroes, that leaves them bloodied and exhausted. Once they have taken the wood and prepared to return, the consequences begin almost immediately to unfold. Enkidu falls into a sickness that will not lift. The gods, angered by the violation of their sacred boundary, send plague and pestilence. What was meant to be glory becomes instead the opening chapter of tragedy, the beginning of loss. As you listen to this and feel your own breathing begin to slow and deepen, it might be worth wondering what the ancient storyteller intended by this strange symmetry. Did they mean to suggest that all human striving contains within it the seeds of sorrow? That every act of taking from nature, even when it produces the most magnificent human creations, carries with it a hidden price? Or were they simply narrating a progression of events, allowing the story to unfold as it unfolded, trusting their listeners to draw their own quiet conclusions as they drifted towards sleep? The cedar forest remains, even now, one of the most evocative images in all of literature. It represents, perhaps, the oldest human fear and the oldest human longing, simultaneously intertwined. It is the place where we wish to go, where we believe we will find answers or glory or immortality, and it is simultaneously the place we fear, because we sense, obscurely but with absolute certainty, that it belongs to something greater than ourselves, that our entry into it will change us in ways we may not wish to be changed. As Gilgamesh and Enkidu pressed onward through the darkness toward that distant tree line, they were not simply journeying toward timber, they were walking toward the discovery of their own mortality, toward grief, toward the slow and painful learning of what it means to be human and not divine. Back in Uruk, where the limestone walls rose pale against the darkening sky, where the people had begun to regard their king differently, less as a tyrant, more as a hero, Gilgamesh walked the terraces of his city with Enkidu at his side. The two had returned victorious, bearing the head of Humbaba, and the exhaustion of their journey seemed only to deepen the bond between them. They moved through the evening markets where merchants were closing their stalls, through the temple courtyards where priests were kindling the first night lamps. And in the hush of that dusk, moving between the mud-brick colonnades, they caught the attention of someone who had long been waiting. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, of desire and vengeance, of the morning star that guides travelers, and the evening brightness that calls them home. Ishtar had been watching. The ancient texts describe her as restless, commanding, one who took what she wanted without negotiation or second thought. She stood in the spaces between earth and heaven, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of divinity, and what she wanted, in that moment, was Gilgamesh. The proposal came not through intermediaries or veiled suggestion, but directly. Ishtar descended toward him with the full force of her will behind her words. She offered him marriage, an alliance with her immortal power. She promised him rewards beyond measure, a chariot of lapis lazuli and carnelian, a house of cedar and gold, harnesses for his animals, clothes fine enough to catch the light of distant fires. In the poetry of the ancient texts, her words flow like honey, like music, like something too beautiful to refuse. And yet, Gilgamesh refused. What would make a man, or even a man partly divine, turn away from a goddess at the height of her beauty and fury? The ancient scribes preserved his response with a kind of unflinching honesty that still carries weight across the millennia. Gilgamesh speaks to Ishtar not with anger, but with a catalogue of truths. He reminds her of what happens to those who love her. He speaks of her first husband Tammuz, who received her affection and then was taken to the underworld, where she mourned him yearly, still mourns him. He names other lovers, other gods and men, transformed into beasts, broken, abandoned. His words are not gentle, but they are deliberate. He is saying something that resonates through the ages. Love given by the gods is not the same as love between mortals. The difference between intimacy and divinity may be vast enough to destroy us. Ishtar's response unfolds with terrible inevitability. A goddess spurned is not merely offended, she is existentially challenged. The texts describe her ascending to the heavens in a fury that shook the foundations of things. And when she reached her father Anu, the king of the gods, her voice was that of one who had been denied something fundamental to her power. She demanded that he send the bull of heaven, a creature of apocalyptic strength, to ravage Gilgamesh and Enkidu, to bring them low, to teach the world what happens when mortals reject divine will. And Anu, whether through reluctance or resignation, whether because he understood the danger, or simply because a father often finds it difficult to refuse his daughter when her voice carries such weight, Anu consented. The bull of heaven descended from the heavens, and its arrival was heralded by drought. The Euphrates ran shallow, the crops in the fields withered where they stood. 7 gates of Uruk trembled as it approached. In the poetry of the account, the creature is portrayed not as a mere animal, but as something older than animals, a vessel of raw power, a walking consequence. Some scholars suggest that behind the myth lies a memory of ecological disaster, a drought cycle that felt like punishment, though these are the kinds of guesses we make softly in the dark. What unfolded next was a battle unlike any the world had seen, or so the story insists. Enkidu and Gilgamesh stood together against the bull of heaven, moving with the synchronization of men who have known each other's hearts. Enkidu seized the beast from behind, while Gilgamesh drove his sword into its neck. The creature fell, and as it fell, Ishtar wailed, a cry heard across the heavens. Some versions describe her standing on the walls of Uruk, hurling curses at Gilgamesh even as the bull's life drained away. She screams that he has humiliated her, shamed her before the gods, destroyed something that should have been indestructible. The victory was real, tangible, but it came at a cost that the ancient audience would have understood immediately, even as modern readers might need to sit with the implications. When you defeat a creature sent by a goddess, when you spill the blood of something divine upon the earth, something has changed in the order of things. The God who sent it cannot ignore the violation. Resentment has been planted in heavenly soil, and it will grow. That night, as Gilgamesh and Enkidu returned through the gates of Uruk in triumph, celebrated by the people who saw in them protectors against chaos and calamity, neither of them fully grasped what their victory had cost. The city was jubilant. Torches burned through the darkness, but in the halls of the gods, in the spaces beyond mortal sight, a sickness was being prepared. A debt was being registered. The two friends had saved their city, had pushed back against divine will itself, and the price for that act of rebellion was already being calculated, measured, prepared. The ancient Mesopotamians would have recognized in this moment something true about the way the world works, that triumph and tragedy often arrive dressed in each other's clothes, that when mortals venture into sacred territories and emerge victorious, something in the order of things shifts, and what comes next is rarely kind. The tablets speak of what came after their triumph in the forest, though the ancient scribes chose their words as though moving through water. Each description weighted with the knowledge of what was to follow. Humbaba lay dead, the great cedar had fallen, and the friends returned to Uruk bearing proof of their glory, their names already beginning to transform into legend among the people who whispered their deeds in the evening markets and by the river's edge. Yet even as crowds gathered to marvel at the two heroes, something darker was already moving through the story, something the gods had set in motion from the moment Gilgamesh rejected Ishtar and her rage had sent the bull of heaven to their gates. The victory had been won, but the price was only beginning to be calculated, measured out in the slow breaking of a body that had once seemed as immortal as the friendship it inhabited. It begins with Enkidu, as so many things in the oldest of stories begin, not with thunder or drama, but with the simplest, most terrible of all onsets. He becomes ill. The texts suggest it was the god's judgment, a punishment that descended as quietly as evening settling over the marshes, as inevitable as the cooling of the stone after the sun has passed. There is no moment of sudden sickness, no clear threshold between health and decline in the way the scribes recorded it. Instead, Enkidu simply begins to fade, his strength leaving him the way water drains from a cupped hand, leaving behind only the shape of what was held. The great hunter who had run naked through the grasslands, with gazelles at his flanks, whose body bore the marks of 1,000 victories, now found himself confined to the chambers of Uruk, his breath growing thin against the weight of what was happening inside him. Imagine, if you will, the texture of those days, the way light moved through the high windows of the palace, striking dust motes that drifted without purpose, the faint sounds of the city continuing its ordinary rhythms far below, children calling, merchants singing their wares, the water wheels turning endlessly along the canals. None of it seemed to touch Enkidu anymore. The friendship that had burned so brightly between the two men now took on a different quality entirely, becoming almost unbearably tender in its fragility. Gilgamesh remained near his companion constantly, watching, waiting, as if by the sheer force of his presence, he might hold back whatever was consuming his closest friend from within. The ancient poems, preserved on clay, in the library of the king who would rule Nineveh 1,000 years after Gilgamesh's earthly reign, describe a kind of vigil. Two men in a room, as the daylight changed, as the seasons moved, almost imperceptibly, from one phase to another, everything narrowing down to the space between them. The scribes tell us that Enkidu had dreams in those final days, or perhaps visions. The distinction between the two blurs in texts so ancient that we cannot always be certain what the original intention was. In his fever or delirium, Enkidu seemed to glimpse something of what lay beyond the threshold of life, the realm of the dead that Mesopotamian theology understood as a gray, diminished place, not evil necessarily, but the complete opposite of fullness, of warmth, of presence. In these dreams, Enkidu spoke of shadows, of a land where those who have died are like broken pottery shards, scattered and without voice, a place where even the greatest kings must bow their heads, where distinction and honor mean nothing, where all the energy and vitality that had defined existence simply ceases to matter. It was a vision of such profound loss that when he spoke it aloud to Gilgamesh, who sat constant at his bedside, both men understood that they were already touching something that could not be untouched, could not be escaped through heroic action or clever negotiation with the gods. And then, as the tablets measure time in their own patient way, Enkidu died, the great friend, the companion who had fought at Gilgamesh's side, who had wrestled him in the streets of Uruk and become inseparable from his destiny, simply departed. The text does not dwell on the moment itself. There is no description of his final breath, or the instant when presence becomes absence, and perhaps this restraint is more powerful than any elaborate account could have been. The ancient scribes understood that some things are best honored by silence, by allowing the reader to feel the shape of the grief, rather than being given every detail of its making. What follows is the raw, unmediated sorrow of Gilgamesh, and here, the texts abandon all pretense of restraint. Here is a king, a god-king, who had seemed beyond ordinary human emotion in his appetites and his power, broken entirely by the death of his friend. He tears at his clothing, he pulls his hair, he cries out in the streets of Uruk with a voice that the ancient writers imagine must have echoed from the walls of the great city and out across the countryside beyond. The controlled, almost formulaic language of the earlier sections of the epic gives way here to something rawer, more direct. Gilgamesh does not compose himself. He does not retreat to kingly dignity. Instead, he abandons everything: his throne, his responsibilities, his very identity as the king who had brought glory to Uruk, and surrenders entirely to his grief. In this moment, something fundamental shifts in the story, something that perhaps explains why this narrative has survived so long, why human beings for 4,000 years have felt the need to preserve it and pass it onward through generation after generation. Because Gilgamesh, in his overwhelming sorrow, finally touches something true about human existence, that all his earlier adventures, all his victories, all his godlike power had obscured. He has discovered, through the body of his friend growing cold, that he too will die. He too will lie in the dust. He too will become a voice crying out from that gray realm that Enkidu glimpsed in his fever, and no amount of courage or strength or cleverness will alter that fate. The tablets speak of this realization washing over him not as philosophy or intellectual understanding, but as pure terror, a terror so complete that it unmakes everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. The friendship had been the measure of his greatness, the thing that had given his victories meaning and weight. Without Enkidu, the city of Uruk, the walls, the canals, the great ziggurat rising into the sky, all of it suddenly seemed hollow, a monument to something that ultimately could not be preserved or protected. And if he could not protect Enkidu, the one being who meant everything to him, then what was the use of all his power? What was the purpose of kingship and conquest when death could walk into a room and take away the thing most precious, indifferent to all the barriers that had been constructed against it? This is the pivot point, the hinge on which the entire epic turns. Everything that follows flows from this moment of breaking, this instant when the king of Uruk, the man who had seemed to possess everything, finds himself holding nothing but the knowledge that all things end, and that the people he loves most cannot be exempted from that universal law. The city walls of Uruk had never felt so confining. In the silence that followed Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh found himself unable to occupy the throne, unable to greet the assembled nobles who came to counsel him, unable to move through the chambers where his friend's presence had filled every corner with loud, warm laughter. The grief that took hold of him was not the measured sorrow of a king mourning a companion. It was the raw, primal terror of a man who had glimpsed his own ending reflected in another's face. And so he did what neither duty nor dignity could permit him to do. In the gray light before dawn, he rose from the royal chambers and walked toward the city gates, leaving behind the reed-woven blinds and the careful order of kingship. Some accounts whisper that he tore the royal garments from his shoulders and cast them aside. Others suggest he simply walked, barefoot, into the scrubland beyond Uruk's walls, as though leaving behind every name and title that had once defined him. The transformation began not with a choice, but with an absence, an emptying out of everything he had been. What must it have felt like, do you suppose, for a man accustomed to dominion to suddenly find himself untethered? The king of Uruk became, in those first hours and days, merely a wanderer. The very identity that had shaped his earliest moments, that had justified his cruelty and his magnificence, had dissolved into insignificance. He was no longer the tyrant of Uruk. He was no longer even quite human in the old way. He was becoming something stranger, something closer to the wild beasts he now encountered. The wilderness he entered was the true antipode of the city. Where Uruk's walls and gates had measured and controlled the world beyond them, the desert and rough scrubland offered no boundaries, no thresholds, no sense of inside and outside. Days blended into nights. The sun scorched him during the hours of brightness, and the cold of the desert floor chilled him when darkness fell. His skin darkened and cracked. His hair grew matted and long, wild as Enkidu's had been in those early days before civilization had smoothed and shaped him. In fleeing the place that had been carved from the earth and human labor, Gilgamesh began to resemble the man he had once civilized, the wild thing he had transformed through friendship. This is not to say he wandered aimlessly, though the texts are often deliberately vague about the precise trajectory of his journey. Rather, he began to search. What he sought had no name yet. It was larger than the recovery of Enkidu, though that was the wound that had opened within him. He was searching, perhaps, for an answer to the question that mortality had posed to him so brutally. If Enkidu could fall, could sicken and fade despite his strength and his nobility, despite the friendship of a king, then what could prevent the same fate from claiming Gilgamesh himself? The search transformed into an obsession, and the obsession hardened into a purpose. He had heard, whispered in the city, and muttered by those ancient ones who still remembered older stories, of Utnapishtim, a man who dwelled far beyond the boundaries of the known world, beyond the waters of death, in a place of exile and survival. Utnapishtim, it was said, had been granted eternal life by the gods themselves. He alone among mortals had tasted immortality and lived beyond the reach of the dark underworld, where Enkidu now waited in silence. If such a place existed, if such a man existed, then perhaps the answer to mortality itself existed as well. Perhaps there were exceptions to the rule of death. Perhaps a clever man, or a strong man, or a man desperate enough and determined enough might find a way to slip through the gates that closed to all others. This is the thought that drove Gilgamesh onward through the wilderness, keeping him moving when his body ached, and when the futility of such a quest might have seemed obvious to a more cautious mind. The path itself became longer and more treacherous the more he traveled. Mountains rose before him. Great walls of rock and snow emerged from the shifting sands. He encountered strange beings, scorpion men whose faces were human, but whose bodies were armored, and whose tails curved with venom. They guarded the mountain passes, the very boundaries between the world he knew and the unknowable realm beyond. When they recognized him, they did not strike him down, though they might have. Instead, they recognized in his hollow eyes and determined stride something that compelled respect. They saw a man driven by purpose that transcended mere survival, and they allowed him passage. Each threshold he crossed carried him further from the man he had been. The kingly robes were long gone, his feet hardened from endless walking. His hands that had once given commands now worked to gather food from the scrubland, to find shelter, to navigate by the stars and the turning of seasons. The wilderness was not, in the ancient Mesopotamian imagination, a place of peaceful restoration or pastoral retreat. It was a place of danger and liminality, a space where the rules that governed civilization held no weight. To enter it was to become half wild oneself, to surrender the protections and constraints of ordered society and move into a realm where different laws applied, laws of hunger and exhaustion, of solitude and endurance. Yet this transformation, grim as it may sound, was also a kind of liberation. For the first time since childhood, Gilgamesh was not performing the role of king. He was not upholding the expectations of a city that demanded his strength and his constant vigilance. He was not managing the paradox of being part god and part man, blessed and cursed with the burden of power. Instead, he was simply moving forward, driven by a question that had become the only thing that mattered. In the wilderness, stripped of title and certainty, Gilgamesh began to search not for power or dominion, but for understanding. Some scholars have suggested that this portion of the epic represents, in mythological language, the kind of internal journey that grief forces upon us all. The loss of Enkidu cracked open the world as Gilgamesh had known it, and the only way forward was to walk into the unknown. His flight was not cowardice, though it might have appeared so to those who remained in the city. It was the beginning of a different kind of kingship, not dominion over others, but mastery over one's own mortality through understanding and acceptance. The wandering itself became a form of pilgrimage, though Gilgamesh did not yet understand this. He was driven onward by desperation and hope intermingled, by the ghost of Enkidu walking invisible beside him, and by the faint rumor of a man, Utnapishtim, who had somehow escaped the universal law that bound all creatures to death. Gilgamesh leaves Uruk not as a king returns from conquest, but as a man fleeing the unbearable weight of what he now knows. Enkidu is ash. The strength that once felt boundless has met its match in something deeper, older, more final than any monster or rival. And so he wanders. The tablets describe him crossing mountains he had never seen, passing through lands where no king held dominion, and the civilized world falls away behind him like a discarded cloak. His purpose hardens into something almost desperate. He will find Utnapishtim, that distant figure, that man who alone among mortals was granted eternal life. If anyone knows the secret of immortality, knows how to cross the boundary between death and endless days, it must be the one who has already done it. The journey itself becomes a kind of pilgrimage across the ancient Near Eastern imagination. Modern scholars who have traced the geography of the tablets, comparing the places named with actual locations known to Mesopotamians, suggest Gilgamesh travels toward the distant western edge of the known world, that mysterious boundary where the waters begin and the earth itself seems to surrender to mystery. There is something deeply human in this, isn't there? The notion that the answer to our deepest questions lies always beyond the horizon, in the place we have not yet reached. Along his path, Gilgamesh encounters figures of almost dreamlike quality. Scorpion men guard a passage through a mountain described as so tall it touches the vault of heaven. These are not conventional enemies to be overcome in battle. Instead, they speak to the king with an eerie courtesy, recognizing something in him that transcends ordinary mortality. They warn him of the darkness ahead, the tunnel through the mountain where the sun itself travels each night, where no light reaches and the way stretches infinite. Yet they permit him passage. There is a strange mercy in this encounter, a sense that even the monstrous guardians of the world understand his grief and allow his desperate quest to continue. And then, in a sequence that becomes the most famous detour within the epic, Gilgamesh reaches the dwelling place of Utnapishtim. But Utnapishtim does not greet him immediately with the secret Gilgamesh seeks. Instead, the ancient man tells a story. He tells of a time long before, when the gods grew weary of the noise and disorder of mankind, when they decided to erase humanity from the earth, through a great flood, a deluge that would wash away all living things. The gods sent a flood so vast, so complete, that for 7 days and 7 nights, the waters covered everything. Mountains vanished. The horizon itself became indistinguishable from sky. Yet one man was warned. Enki, the god of wisdom and waters, whispered to Utnapishtim, or in some versions whispered to the reeds of his house. Build a boat, he was told. Gather your family. Gather the creatures of the earth, 2 of each kind, or 7 of the clean animals, and 14 of the unclean. The symmetry of creation must be preserved, even as creation itself is undone. And so Utnapishtim built his vessel and loaded it with the seeds of all things living, and when the flood came, he rowed it. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and he sent out birds to find if land existed anywhere still. First a dove, which found no perch and returned, then a swallow, which also returned, finally a raven, which did not come back, suggesting it had found something solid to land upon. Now, any listener who has heard the biblical flood narrative, the story of Noah and his ark, will recognize this account with an immediacy that can feel almost uncanny. How could a Mesopotamian story thousands of years older contain such specific echoes? The scholarly explanation, which is supported by centuries of research, points not to plagiarism in either direction, but to a shared cultural memory, a story that circulated throughout the ancient Near East in various forms, told and retold until it shaped the consciousness of many peoples. The versions from Mesopotamia are in some ways older in the written record, though of course oral versions may have traveled far beyond what any tablet can show us. The parallels are undeniable: the divine decision to destroy humanity through water, the single righteous man chosen to preserve life, the animals gathered in pairs, the careful search for land as the waters recede. Yet each version bears the imprint of its own culture, its own theology. The Mesopotamian Utnapishtim is one survivor among many possibilities, while the biblical Noah becomes singular, chosen by the God who will never again flood the earth, bound by a covenant. Why does Utnapishtim tell this story to Gilgamesh, this weary king searching for immortality? Perhaps because survival through catastrophe, through the undoing of the world itself, is itself a kind of answer to the question of what endures. Utnapishtim survived not through strength or wisdom, but through being chosen. He was spared when all others perished, and for this survival, the gods granted him something unprecedented: eternal life. He and his wife were taken beyond the range of ordinary time, hidden away in a distant place where they would know neither hunger, nor sickness, nor the weight of years. He achieved immortality, not through defeating death, but through being removed from the world where death holds dominion. There is something almost mournful in how this story is offered to Gilgamesh. It is a mirror held up to his own search, and in that mirror, he may begin to glimpse a truth he does not yet fully comprehend. The way to eternal life, as it turns out, is not a method that can be learned or seized. It is a gift. It is given by powers beyond human reach to those whom those powers choose, and once given, it cannot be taken back, or transferred, or shared. It belongs entirely to the one who receives it. The message in this story, offered with the gentleness of one ancient man speaking to another across the gulf of desperate need, is that immortality, as Gilgamesh seeks it, may not exist, not for him, not for anyone like him. And yet Gilgamesh does not accept this answer. Not at first. He asks Utnapishtim for a test, a trial, some way to prove himself worthy of what was granted so freely to another. Utnapishtim poses a challenge: remain awake for 7 days and 7 nights. Surely if the king cannot overcome mere sleep, how can he hope to overcome death itself? It is a test that seems almost mocking in its simplicity, and yet, as Gilgamesh sits in the presence of his teacher, a strange thing happens. The exhaustion of his long journey, the grief that still weighs upon him, the simple fact of being a human body in a human world, all these things overtake him. One by one, each day he falls asleep. 7 days, 7 nights, and each time he awakens, Utnapishtim marks a loaf of bread beside him, so that when Gilgamesh rises, confused and desperate, claiming he has been awake, he can see the evidence of how long he has slumbered. How many loaves are moldy? How many days have passed while he believed himself alert? And so Gilgamesh arrives at last at the edge of the waters that lie between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Utnapishtim waits for him there, that lone survivor of the great flood, the man whom the gods themselves granted the gift of eternal life. The exhausted king stands before this ancient being, this living proof that immortality is possible, that death might not have the final word, and something in Gilgamesh's chest tightens with a desperate hope that has carried him across deserts and through mountains and past dangers that would have turned lesser men to dust. Utnapishtim listens to the story of his grief, to the account of Enkidu's passing, to the raw catalogue of loss that Gilgamesh pours out like water from a broken vessel. And the old man, who has seen civilizations rise and crumble, who has watched the waters recede from the world and lived to tell of it, nods with a kind of tender understanding. He does not turn away the king. Instead, he offers him a test, not a trial of strength or cunning, but something far more subtle, far more intimate. Sleep, Utnapishtim says, is the brother of death. If you cannot master sleep for a single night, how do you expect to master immortality itself? And so Gilgamesh sits, determined to prove himself, his eyes burning with the force of his will. But the warmth of the place wraps around him like a shroud of necessity. His eyelids, so heavy now with the weight of everything he has endured, begin to close. One by one, his fingers relax, his breathing deepens and softens. And though he fights with every measure of his royal authority against the tide of slumber, within moments he surrenders to it completely. Sleep claims him as it claims all mortals. The king, the wild man, the seeker of eternity, all the same when darkness falls. He sleeps not for minutes, but for what seems like an age. When his eyes open again, sunlight has moved across the room. The night has passed, and Utnapishtim, watching with eyes that have seen the birth and death of worlds, simply smiles. You have failed, he tells the king. But before Gilgamesh can fall into despair, the old man offers him something else. A secret, a whispered mercy. There is, he says, a plant that grows in the deepest waters of this place. A plant unlike any other. Its leaves are soft and unguarded. Its purpose is singular and clear. It can restore youth. It cannot grant immortality, cannot make a man live forever, but it can wind back the years that have marked his body. It can return him to the flower of his strength. This gift Utnapishtim offers not as a test, but as a consolation, an acknowledgement that though the king has not proven himself worthy of eternal life, he might at least return to his people with something of his former vitality restored. Gilgamesh descends into the waters where no mortal was meant to go. The depths are cold and strange, and yet something in him understands this journey. He has been descending, in a way, since Enkidu died. He has been moving deeper and deeper into the territory of the soul, and this physical descent into the waters is only the continuation of that inward falling. And there, in the dark beneath the surface, he finds it, the plant. It is small, almost insignificant. You might pass it by and never notice, might walk through 1,000 gardens and never recognize it for what it is. But Gilgamesh knows. He gathers it carefully, and as he breaks the surface and gasps for air, he holds it in his hands like an answer to a prayer. He plans to bring it back to Uruk. He will taste it himself. He will share it with his people. Perhaps he will distribute it among the elders, the builders, the merchants, the mothers. Perhaps some version of youth, of renewal, of the return of strength and beauty and clarity, will ripple outward from this moment and touch the lives of many. But the world, you understand, has its own way of unfolding. Gilgamesh, exhausted from his descent, decides to rest beside a pool of fresh water. He leaves the plant on the ground nearby, while he washes the salt and silt from his body, while he allows the coolness of the water to soothe the rawness that travel has worn into his skin. And in that moment of rest, in that vulnerable space where he has set down his burden for just a breath, something moves in the world. A serpent, drawn by the scent or the shimmer, or perhaps by some force that scholars and storytellers have spent centuries trying to interpret, emerges from the rocks and waters nearby. The snake, in all its ancient wisdom and hunger, takes the plant, and whether this is accident or design, whether it is a deliberate theft or simply the blind need of a creature seeking to sustain itself, the result is the same. The plant is consumed. The serpent, we are told, sheds its skin and emerges renewed, transformed, returns to the vigor of youth. But Gilgamesh is left with empty hands. The gift is gone. Now, here is where the story holds you, if you listen carefully enough. Gilgamesh does not rage. He does not curse the gods or the fates or the serpent for its hunger. Instead, something quieter happens within him, something that mirrors the slow acceptance that sleep itself brings to the waking mind. He sits in the knowledge of loss. He acknowledges, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he cannot control everything. He cannot chase down every possibility. He cannot seize eternity. He cannot even keep a gift once he has been given it. Some things are taken. Some things slip away. Some things are meant to be relinquished. This is the moment, scholars suggest, when Gilgamesh truly matures, not when he was king, for kingship can belong to the arrogant and the foolish, not when he was a warrior, for warriors may have strength but lack wisdom, but here, in the absence of the plant, in the emptiness of his hands, in the recognition that a serpent, a creature far smaller and less mighty than he, has taken from him what he could not keep or protect or hold. The journey home begins then, not with the urgency of a man racing toward a prize, but with the slower pace of someone who has learned to accept. And as Gilgamesh makes his way back across the mountains and deserts, back toward Uruk, back toward the city he once despised for its walls and its limitations, something in his understanding has shifted. He is still the same man. His body has not been restored to youth. He has not gained immortality. But something in his consciousness has changed, has softened, has deepened in a way that no plant could ever touch. He walks back knowing that death will come for him as it comes for all mortals. He walks knowing that his strength will fade, that his hands will grow thin, that the day will arrive when he can no longer wield a sword or command armies or impose his will upon the world through force. And rather than this knowledge filling him with despair, it settles into him like a kind of strange peace. And so the long journey home unfolds, quieter now than the outward quest had been. Gilgamesh moves through the lands he once crossed with Enkidu beside him, but the world has shifted into a different register, muted by memory and the weight of acceptance. The steps flatten. The rivers he had crossed in haste now seem to slow their current as he walks their banks, and somewhere in the rhythm of his footsteps, there is no longer the fever of a man running from death, but rather the measured pace of someone who has walked through it and returned. The city rises before him as it always has, its mud brick walls catching the late light in tones of amber and deep rose. Those walls, those magnificent, sun-baked walls that Gilgamesh had caused to be built in lifetimes before, when he was a king of absolute will and godlike appetite, when his own name seemed to matter more than anything else in the world. And yet, as he draws near now, as the gates open to receive him, something in the sight of them has transformed, not the walls themselves, but the eyes that look upon them. Can a place remain unchanged when the person returning to it has been remade by sorrow and knowledge? The question floats without urgency in the still air. The ziggurats still pierce the pale sky. The irrigation channels still trace their patient geometries through the fields beyond the city. Market calls echo in the narrow streets, just as they did before. Shepherds guide their flocks toward the evening pens. The machinery of human life continues, indifferent to any one man's journey into grief. And yet Gilgamesh, walking these familiar streets, sees them now as a mortal sees them, not as a king who moves through them like a force of nature, but as someone who understands, finally, that he too will be dust. The people recognize him. They bow, for he is still their king, still the one who rules with authority and whose decisions shape their days. But something in their recognition has shifted too, or perhaps Gilgamesh has simply become aware of it for the first time. He is no longer the figure of untouchable power who once ground them under the weight of his restlessness. He has become instead a man whom sorrow has touched visibly, whom loss has carved into a different shape. And there is, in that recognition, perhaps, a strange new form of connection, the bond that forms between mortals who understand that they are all traveling toward the same inevitable shore. He stands at last before his throne room, and for a moment there is silence. The cedar beams overhead, some of them brought back from that distant forest where Humbaba once guarded his trees, rise toward a ceiling he had once gazed upon, as though it might never end. How different they seem now. The treasure of that victory, the wood that had cost so much blood and transformed so much darkness in his heart, now simply frames the space where he must sit and govern. It is still beautiful, but it is no longer a triumph to contemplate. It is simply part of the world as it is. The tablets, the cuneiform pressed into clay by scribes, those records of his deeds that would outlast him, they matter now in a different way than they did before. Gilgamesh, we must imagine, understands this with a clarity that no amount of ordinary reflection could provide. The stories that the scholars tell us he may have caused to be written, the inscriptions that would travel across centuries and deserts and become the very words we speak today, they are not monuments erected against death. They are something quieter and more honest. They are conversations across time. They are a man reaching forward into an unknown future and saying, in the only way he can, that he lived, that he loved, that he suffered, that he came to know his own finitude. What is legacy, then, but the echo of a voice that continues to speak long after the throat that made it has turned to earth? The question settles gently into the air around the throne room, and Gilgamesh would have felt its weight in those final years of his reign. The monuments he had built, the laws he had decreed, the city he had ruled with such brutal vigor, all of these would continue without him. But they would also fade. Cities crumble. Laws are rewritten. Even the greatest works of human hands return eventually to the dust from which they came. And yet, there is something else. The story itself becomes the monument. Not the walls of Uruk, though they were impressive, and not the cedar brought from the distant forest, though it was precious beyond measure, but the fact that someone remembered. Someone spoke of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and their friendship, and their failure, and their mortality. Someone pressed the words into clay. Someone buried those tablets, and they waited in the dark for thousands of years, until other hands, in a time so far distant that it might as well be another world entirely, would uncover them, and read them, and understand that a man had lived, and had mattered, and had finally accepted that all things must end. Walking the ramparts of Uruk in the cool of evening, perhaps Gilgamesh could sense something of this. Not the future exactly, for mortals cannot know the future, but perhaps a kind of peace in the fact that the story itself would endure, would be retold, would find its way across the centuries and speak to people he could never have imagined. Perhaps he understood, in his bones and in the quiet of his now humbled heart, that to be remembered is a kind of immortality. Not the immortality of the flesh, which he had sought and failed to find and finally relinquished, but the immortality of meaning, the immortality of words spoken and preserved, of a life that becomes part of the larger conversation of what it means to be human. The walls of Uruk stand in the gathering darkness, their shadows lengthening across the streets and gardens they enclose. They are still great walls. They are still impressive, but they are also fragile in their own way, vulnerable to time as all things are. And Gilgamesh, the king who once seemed invulnerable, now understands this. He has been broken, not by any human hand, but by the simple fact of his own mortality, by the loss of the one person who had truly known him. And in that breaking, something has been remade. The people of Uruk sleep tonight, as they have slept for countless nights before, within walls that still protect them, under a king who still rules them. But that king is no longer the same. He has traveled far. He has seen marvels and suffered griefs that the ordinary mind can barely contain. He has come to know that he will die, and in that knowledge, paradoxically, he has learned to live more fully, more humanly, more truly. And the walls, standing solid against the night, will eventually fall. The city will be abandoned. The irrigation channels will dry and disappear beneath the sand. But the words will remain. The story will go on. And in that continuation, in that act of remembering and retelling, Gilgamesh achieves something that no amount of restlessness or ambition could ever have secured. He becomes eternal, not through his refusal of mortality, but through his acceptance of it. He becomes a voice in the darkness, calling across the millennia to those who come after, saying, in the language of myth and dream, that a man lived here, that he mattered, that he loved, that he failed, and that all of this together, the triumph and the sorrow and the finally earned understanding, is what it means to be human, mortal, precious, and temporary. And so we return, after so many nights of wandering, to the question that drew us into the dusty chambers of Nineveh in the first place. Why does this story pressed into clay 4,000 years ago by hands whose names we will never know, still find its way into the quiet hours when the modern world has finally grown still? Why does Gilgamesh speak to us at all, especially now, when you lie in the half-light between waking and sleep, your own restless mind perhaps echoing his? It might be that the answer is simpler than we imagine. Gilgamesh, in his essence, is not a king in some distant, untouchable realm of mythic grandeur. He is a man who discovers, as we all do in the small hours of the night, that power and achievement cannot save him from what comes for everyone. He learns this, not through philosophy or gentle instruction, but through the death of the one he loves most. There is no shortcut past that particular knowledge. No amount of building, conquering, or changing the world can make it otherwise. The Mesopotamians understood this 4 millennia ago, just as we do tonight, and that recognition itself is a strange comfort. Consider what the ancient poets were actually telling their audiences as darkness fell in those reed-lit halls. They were saying, yes, you will be restless. Yes, you will push against the boundaries of what is permitted. Yes, you will reach for immortality in 1,000 small ways. Through your works, your children, your name carved into something that lasts. And yes, all of it will fail, ultimately, in the way that matters most. But look at what Gilgamesh brought back from his wandering. Not invincibility, not eternal youth, not even answers precisely. He brought back the ability to see his own walls, the walls he built so long ago, and to find them beautiful because he made them, and because they still stand, and because his people still inhabit them and carry forward their lives within them. There is something profoundly restful in that paradox, is there not? The acceptance that our time is limited does not diminish what we create within that time. If anything, it deepens it. The walls of Uruk were not less impressive to Gilgamesh when he understood that he would not occupy them forever. They were more impressive, in a way that only mortality can make things. 100 years or 100 centuries. Does it matter, really? Either way, we are a moment in something larger than ourselves, and the work we do, the people we love, the small acts of tending and building that fill our days, these are not rendered meaningless by their impermanence. They are rendered meaningful by it. The story of Gilgamesh was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, long after the civilization that created it had fallen into ruin. Scribes in Assyrian libraries, in Hittite temples, in Egyptian outposts, kept pressing his story into clay because something in it refused to fade. It spoke to kings and merchants and farmers and priests, and now it speaks to you, lying in the darkness. Your own mortality as close and real as it was the moment you first became aware of it. We have not moved so far from those ancient listeners as we imagine. We still restless, we still push, we still grieve. We still search for meaning in a world that does not explain itself. And perhaps that is why Gilgamesh rises from the clay each night, when a mind like yours seeks the story out. Not because it answers the fundamental questions. It does not, and it never has. But because it honors them. It says, this is what it means to be aware that you will die. This is what it feels like to love someone and then lose them. This is the particular loneliness of being a creature that understands its own ending. And here, in the telling, you are not alone with it. Thousands of years of listeners have walked this same dark path with you. Kings and slaves and scribes and ordinary people lying in the darkness, just as you are now, have heard the story and recognized themselves in it. The clay tablets have turned to dust, or been preserved in museums, or lost entirely to time. The Euphrates flows still, changed and flowing through a different world. Uruk itself is a ruin now, though its walls, what remains of them, still mark the earth where Gilgamesh once walked, restless and desperate and human. The language that preserved his story is dead, readable now only by scholars who learned it from books, not from living breath. And yet the story endures, translated and retranslated, brought forward into every era that comes along, speaking to each generation in its turn. Perhaps this is the only immortality that matters, not the false immortality that Gilgamesh sought, the way to escape time's current entirely, but the real immortality of being remembered, of having your words and struggles recognized by others who came after, who recognized themselves in your seeking. That is what has happened to Gilgamesh. He remains a king in the way that truly matters, not because he will never die, but because his death, and his response to it, still teaches us something about what it means to be alive. As you drift now into the deeper waters of sleep, you carry with you the understanding that he came to, at last, in the quiet moment when he looked upon his walls and accepted both their beauty and their impermanence. He learned to love his place in time rather than raging against it. He learned that kingship is not about duration, but about tending, about the quality of what you build and how you treat the people within your walls. He learned, finally, to rest. And perhaps, in that learning, which crosses 4,000 years to reach you tonight in the darkness, lies the true treasure he brought back from his journey. Not the secret of eternal life, which does not exist, but the secret of living well within the time that is given, of seeing what you have made and what you have loved, and of finding in that vision a kind of peace that does not depend on forever. That peace is available to you now, as your breathing deepens and your thoughts begin to drift like the waters of the Euphrates in its eternal, patient flow. The story is told, the hero has returned, and in his homecoming, we find permission for our own rest.